Human Anatomy, Chapter 9, Part 2, the brain. And so today we're going to be talking about the brain and taking a look at its particular function, breaking it apart. We know that the brain itself weighs about 3 pounds. It's not a big organ, yet it has all the vital functions for us to maintain our lives. It contains about 100 billion neurons. And remember when we talked about the neuron, we said that the neurons, once we reach maturity, do not continue mitotic division. And so it's very important when we talk about the brain. So let's see if I can go from, there we go. The brain itself is covered and protected by the meninges. The meninges is in 3 layers. We have the dura mater. All right, so here's the outside skull. There's the dura. Here we have the arachnoid mater. And finally, this little fine, thin layer, the pia mater. The dura mater is, if we looked under the skull, we'd see a white covering of the brain, and that's the dura. Underneath that is the framework that really protects this. Kind of like under a sidewalk or under a road, there's an underlying matrix there, and that's what the arachnoid is. It contains the cerebrospinal fluid, so that's filled with fluid that actually acts as a cushion for the brain. So when we get hit, we get jostled around. This is actually what they're studying, what's going on in the arachnoid layer as that brain starts to rattle around. And then finally, the pia mater, which is a very thin matter. All of it collectively is the meninges. When we talk about meningitis, that is a problem for many college students. In fact, you guys that are going to be leaving for college in the fall, you will have to have a physical, and usually part of that physical, if you haven't had your vaccination to prevent meningitis, they will give you that at that time. Because what it does, meningitis, is it attacks the meninges, the dura, the arachnoid, and the pia mater, and it can cause death. There is bacterial meningitis, which is much more severe than viral meningitis, but both of them are very severe type of problem for the brain and can lead to long-term recovery and or death. The cerebrospinal fluid is a clear, colorless fluid. It circulates in the arachnoid layer, and as I said, it acts as a cushion. Sometimes in severe brain injury, that fluid will leak out and cause swelling in the brain. And because the skull is solid at that point, what we find is that they will have to often drill a hole into the skull and allow that cushioning material, that cerebrospinal fluid, to drain. Sometimes it leaks out through the nose. And one has to be careful if they've suffered any kind of head injury. If they see a clear fluid coming from the nose, it may in fact be cerebrospinal fluid. Sometimes babies are born and they're not able to drain that fluid properly, and it can cause damage to the brain. And so one of the things they often do with babies' physicals is that they'll measure the skull to make sure that it maintains a normal size. Sometimes they can put a drain in, as they've done with this baby, and it eventually will drain the skull and no further actions required. In some cases, they have to put a permanent drain in. And so that drain tubing goes down into the stomach, which constantly drains that cerebrospinal fluid and prevents any kind of damage from occurring as a result of the compression that would put on the ventricles in the brain. The major brain structures are the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. The cerebrum's divided into 4 lobes, which match the bones that cover it: the frontal, the parietal, the occipital, and the temporal. The diencephalon is on the side, located around the ear, and that includes the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. The brainstem, located at the top of the spinal cord, includes the midbrain, pons, and the medulla oblongata. Medulla oblongata is primarily responsible for our autonomic functions, and the cerebellum. So here we take a look at it. There, this green area is the brain stem, and we'll notice right at the bottom of the brain, and kind of between the diencephalon and the brain stem, is the pituitary gland, which is our master gland. Back here we have the cerebellum, which is a control center. You're going to find that we've got vision and auditory and reading, and all of that is kind of found in this area. We have midbrain, which is between the diencephalon and the cerebrum. Then we have the cerebrum, which is the main part of the brain, which is really where our intellect is actually involved. So the cerebrum is divided into two hemispheres, and we've got the right and left hemisphere. It's divided by this longitudinal fissure. A fissure is a deep groove that exists in the brain that divides it into the two hemispheres. On the surface area, what we're going to see are these ridges. Kind of think of it as like ridges as you're looking at a big field. And these are the gyri. We've got creases that will occur, kind of like folds, and they're the sulci. And then the fissures are deep grooves, and you're going to find that our deepest memories are actually stored in these deep grooves that we call fissure. It's all connected by the corpus callosum. The function is, of course, the intelligence, memory, and learning. And it also includes the olfactory bulb. So here we're looking at the frontal lobes of the brain. Remember, we said this is the last area developed. There's the left and right hemispheres. Here's the parietal lobe, and finally the parietal occipital lobe, which is toward the back. And just another view looking at the side. So we're going to see the gyri, which are kind of like these kind of little humps. Then we've got the folds that occur with the sulcus. And then finally, the fissures, which are very deep sulcus. So as I use the example of riding a bicycle. Once you learn to ride a bike, you're using a multisensory approach. You've got the eyes, the hands, the feet, so you've got the coordination of all that. So lots of sensory input coming in, and after a period of time, it creates a permanent fissure in the brain. And so when we talk to people who are dealing with any type of brain injury, which may cause memory loss or dementia, any kind of dementia that may occur, generally it doesn't affect this area, these deep fissures. This is why long-term memory stays in place, because it's not out here on the surface with the gyri and the sulca. So if we take a look at the functions in the brain, let's start right here. The olfactory bulb is actually right here, and that's where we smell. All right. Sense of taste is more toward the midbrain, or middle of the brain, just above the diencephalon. And yet, when we can't smell, we also can't taste. Speech, right in the frontal lobe. All right, our motor control is just behind our area for speech. There's the central sulcus, that central fold. All right, touch and pressure are directly behind that. Parietal lobe is our body awareness, is how we function in space, our balance, and things of that nature. Language development is at the parietal occipital lobe. Vision and reading. Look at how all three of those are tied together. All right. And facial recognition is a little bit deeper in. All right. So when we take a look at the brain, we look at the primary functions. This is the right and left side. Remember, the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. The right side of the brain controls the left side of the body. And so we can go right on up, starting with, take a look at the tongue, the pharynx, the jaw, the nose, the lips, and then we go from the thumb all the way down into the toes, and then finally the genitals, and where they're controlled in the brain. So let's look at the different sections. The diencephalon, where education occurs, this is primarily what we're looking at because we got reading, language, all of those being developed right in this area. Now, the diencephalon contains three main areas. So thalamus, which is the main relay station. Smell is up here, so smell's not in there. So it integrates all of our other senses and sends it to whatever part of the cerebrum it needs to go to. The hypothalamus, which is underneath it, controls the blood pressure, the GI tract, so the movement of the GI tract as move foods along, our heart rate, our body temperature, how we process water and the electrolytes, hunger, thirst. It stimulates the pituitary. Remember, the pituitary lies right under the hypothalamus. And it regulates our sleep and wake patterns. The sleep and wake patterns are here, but our biological clock is in the pineal gland. And so how we develop at certain rates, and it's all related, again, back to that pituitary gland and how we function. The brain stem, as I said, includes midbrain, which is an integral center. It actually is a pathway. Think of it as kind of like a beltway. And we go off at different areas depending upon what part of the brain needs to be accessed. The pons is the bridge that gets us there. All right, and the medulla oblongata is where our autonomic functions are. It's right at the top of the brain stem. So it's our heart rate, it's our blood pressure, respiration, all of those are located right here in the medulla oblongata. The cerebellum, which is that area that lies under the occipital bones, controls all our muscular coordination. So it helps us maintain our posture, allows us to be well coordinated. So when we perform certain tasks, even something so simple as crawling to walking, that is something that becomes a learned process. As the muscles get stronger, baby learns to roll over, eventually learns to crawl and learns to walk. So once those skills are learned and integrated into the cerebellum, they become involuntary. So it's very close to the autonomic system. When we look at brain disorders and diseases, these common brain areas are concussion. Usually they're temporary, but after several concussions, and certainly with all the information we know about concussion today, is that we know it can be very serious. It's not something quite so simple as we once thought it was. Symptoms, we see headaches, sometimes confusion, memory loss, lack of concentration, and this is why they spend so much time with you athletes taking a baseline measurement so that if there's any kind of blow to the brain, to the skull, they're able to determine that a concussion may have in fact occurred. A contusion is a bruising that occurs in the brain, and it can cause capillary to leak, and it commonly occurs after concussion. The pia mater in some cases can actually be damaged. All right, in this case, we have a loss of consciousness, decreased blood pressure, cessation of respiration, and this becomes very serious. And a laceration is a tear of the brain, a large vessel rupture, and this can lead to death if not dealt with immediately. Brain tumors are when we have some type of tumor that occurs within the brain itself. And what we see is the astrocytes are often part of that. We see a lot of the tumors occur in this diencephalon area, and a lot of people, the glial cells, the optic glia, believe that this may be related to the batteries we use in our cell phones, constantly interfering with this part of the brain. And so this is why they recommend that when you're on a cell phone, that you don't have it up close to your ear, that you're using the speaker. Of course, it's not always conducive to using a speaker, but it is safer for you in that case. We have aneurysm, and aneurysm is either a bulge that occurs in a major artery that's feeding the brain, or it's an actual rupture. If this ruptures, the chances of surviving are very, very slim. It can occur without any kind of other issue. Strokes are usually a blood vessel, a blood clot that's blocking part of the blood flow into the brain, or there's blood pressure, there's some type of hemorrhage that occurs in and around the brain, and so that part of the brain is affected. And we find if it's on the right side of the body, right side of the brain, it'll affect the left side of the body because of the crossover effect. And it's a very serious condition. Sometimes there are precursors to a stroke that are often ignored, maybe headache, loss of balance, loss of speech, can't think of words, and often they will lead to these, the hemorrhagic stroke, which is the bleeding into the brain, or ischemic stroke, which is a blood clot into the brain. And so often it includes paralysis, loss of speech, loss of vision, loss of memory, and often death. Now, I want you to work on the study guide on the brain, which will go over a lot of this material that we just covered. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me at your convenience. This ends the lecture on the brain.